A long time ago, in the ancient province of Musashi, there were two woodcutters, Masaku and Minokichi. Mosaku was somewhat elderly, but Minokichi was still a very young man. One cold night, the two men were returning from their work. When they arrived at the ferry crossing, a heavy snowstorm started to blow. The small ferry boat was tied up on the opposite bank, but they could see neither hide nor hair from the ferryman. "This is bad," shouted Masaku through the swirling snow. "We'll never be able to get home like this." "The ferryman's probably gone home because of the blizzard," Minokichi concluded. There was nothing else they could do but go inside the ferryman's hut. There was no place to light a fire in the small hut, nor were there any windows. Covering themselves with their straw raincoats, they lay down to sleep, but the cold was almost too much to bear. After a short while, Mosaku fell asleep, but young Minokichi was wide awake, listening to the sound of the wind as it swirled violently around the hut, which shook with each gust as though it was an earthquake. It was difficult to tell how much time had passed, but Minokichi suddenly felt something cold in his head and opened his eyes. The door of the hut, which they had tightly fastened, had somehow opened and now banging in the wind. Then something white seemed to hover over Mosaku as he lay sleeping. Doing his best to see by the light of the snow, Minokichi could make out a woman dressed in a pure white kimono. The woman breathed what looked like white smoke over Mosaku's head. It was all Minokichi could do to keep from shouting in terror. The woman now approached Minokichi, squatted down next to his pillow, and peered at his face for a long time. The woman was quite beautiful, but there was something frightening about the way she looked at him. Then she smiled. "I thought I would do the same thing to you as I did to your companion," she whispered, "but it seems a shame, so I'll let you go." "You must never tell anyone what you've seen tonight. If you do, I'll have to kill you." The woman's expression suddenly became quite frightening, but then she turned and left the hut. Minokichi leapt up, but the woman was nowhere to be seen. "This must have been a dream," he thought to himself, and closing the door tightly again looked over at Mosaku. The old man somehow looked a little strange, and when Minokichi shook him gently, there was no response. He then put his hand on Mosaku's forehead, but with a gasp drew it back immediately. Mosaku's entire body was cold as ice. The next morning, when the snowstorm had abated, the ferryman returned to his hut and found the two men collapsed on the floor. "Hey, pull yourself together," he half shouted at Minokichi, slapping him slightly on the cheeks until he opened his eyes. "I'm alive," the young man mumbled. The ferryman helped Minokichi over to a hibachi, but Mosaku was dead and quite still. When Minokichi returned to his village, he said nothing about what had occurred the night before. Even when his own mother asked questions about what had happened, he remained silent. But finally, he regained his health and was ready to go out to the mountains once again. One night the following winter, Minokichi was on his way home when he encountered a woman traveling to some destination or another. She was a young woman, tall and slender, and very pretty. As they walked along together, they talked about various things and very soon became good friends. If you'd like, Minokichi offered, you could stay over at my house tonight. There's no one else there but my mother. And so saying, accompanied the young woman to his house. The young lady's name was Oyuki. Yuki means snow in Japanese. And she was not only pretty but had a very gentle nature. Minokichi's mother was also completely captivated by their guest, and so asked her to stay the following night as well. After spending a number of days together, the two young people found it hard to even think about partying, and now it was arranged that they would get married and live as husband and wife. Minokichi's mother, of course, gave her hearty approval. My son has found a wonderful, the lady exclaimed, and from then on let Oyuki take charge of all the household affairs. At length, one child after another was born, and Minokichi found himself the father of five children. Surrounded by the grandchildren and a gentle daughter in law, Minokichi's mother felt that she could now die in peace. And when her fifth grandchild was born, she passed away as though she was just going to sleep. After that, even more children were, until there were 10 of them. Each child had a beautiful pale skin and an attractive face. The woman of the village, however, looked upon Oyuki with envy. Oyuki never seems to get older. One of them complained, she still looks like a young woman. That's true, said another, even though she never stops working the entire day. That's strange, isn't it? But when he heard of these things, Minokichi was all the happier. Ha, he thought, I'm a very lucky man. One night, however, when the children were asleep, Minokichi was drinking some sake, and his wife did needlework next to a paper lantern. Sometimes when I look at you, he began, I think about that night. That woman was a beautiful young lady, exactly like you. Oyuki suddenly stopped and put down her needlework. Really? She said, seemingly without emotion. Where did you meet her? Well, you know, Minokichi continued, with a faraway look in his eyes, and he related the entire story about what had occurred when he was a young man at the ferryman's hut that night. But that woman was not human. She may actually have been a snow woman. With these last words, Oyuki threw down the kimono she had been sewing and turned to Minokichi. How dare you break your promise? She demanded. That snow woman was me. Didn't I tell you that I'd kill you if you told anyone about me? She crouched down over the reclining Minokichi. It it was you, he stammered, turning pale, for she was undeniably the woman of that time long ago. If it weren't for the children, I'd kill you right now, she hissed. But thinking of them, I just can't. You had better take good care of them though. If I ever hear that you mistreated them, I'll finish you off on the spot. With that, Oyuki seemed to grow smaller and smaller until at last she was nothing but white snow, drifting out of the window, and never once did she appear again.